Mac Power Users, episode 616. The quality will be ensured with Daniel Jalkut. Hello and welcome back to Mac Power Users. My name is Stephen Hackett, and I'm joined as always by my friend and yours, Mr. David Sparks.
Hey, Stephen. How are you feeling?
Better. Better. Like 90%.
Did you just hear that Siri went off in my room when I said, "Hey, Stephen"?
I was wondering if
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Apple.
Yeah, I keep the HomePods in my studio where they don't listen, so it doesn't accidentally happen. But on occasion, I'll forget that, and I'll be working on something. Like I've been building these frames for some acoustic paneling, and I'll yell out "Hey, voice assistant, play some music," and then they just don't do anything because I've told them to not listen. I have to go over and press the top. You can't win either way, is what I'm saying.
I think it's funny that we all just decided to stop asking Apple to give us the option to change the call phrase. Like that was the thing for a long time, and now everybody we've all surrendered. We're like, okay, well, I guess I'll just never use the word "hey" again, except when talking to this digital assistant. Anyway. Boy, that's a downer to start the show on. But hey, we got a guest here. Welcome to the show, Daniel Jalkut.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm here to apologize to you.
What'd you do?
It has been almost 10 years since you've been on the show. I mean, what in the heck, man? I think it's Steven's fault. I kept saying like 5 years ago, I'm like, we got to get Daniel back on, and Steven's like, nope. Can't have that guy.
Yeah, it seems like I was on a lot more often before Steven came around.
Yeah, I think so. Well, we all agree it's Steven's fault. We all agree it's Steven's fault. Now, Daniel is, in the community. He podcasts. He creates applications. He used to work for Apple, and he is a Mac Power user. And we are so happy to have you back.
Awesome to be back. And yeah, as you said, it's actually, if we would have waited until February of 2022, it would be, I think it was March of 2022 would be 10 years exactly. So we got in under the wire. We're gonna keep it. Let's keep my visits to at least every 10 years.
Well, it's going to be much more than that because you have so much great stuff to share. When we were doing our prep call, I'm like, how did we not get Daniel back sooner? He has so much good information for our listeners. But hey, you know what? We all make mistakes. So we
you are absolved. You are forgiven.
We got to turn the page, a couple things before we get into the show today. Just a few announcements. If you're listening to this on Sunday when we release the episode, there's 1 day left. I'm doing just like everybody else, I'm doing one of those sales for Thanksgiving. But I've got a big one. It's 20% off everything in the store. It's Turkey 21, and it's going to expire on Monday after the show publishes. So you're in just under the wire if you're interested in that. Also, I am speaking at the Nonprofit Productivity Summit, and it's a really great list of speakers, Mike Vardy, David Allen, some other folk. And it's about getting more productive when you run your nonprofit. But there's, I think, actually a lot of great content in there, even if you're running a for-profit company. So go check it out, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But it's nonprofitproductive.com, and if you get to that website, you'll find the summit, and you can log in for it there. And on More Power Users today, we are going deep on cooking. Sometimes it's bratwurst, but today, gang, it's pizza. Daniel is can I say you're a semi-professional pizza maker, Daniel?
No, you may not, but you may say that I am a semi-confident pizza maker.
I feel like when Italians see Daniel walking down the street, they bow down to him to say you are the greatest pizza maker, right? Something like that. Anyway,
hasn't happened yet, but
Either way, when you take a nerd and give them some sort of cooking task, it always has interesting results, and we're going to get into that today in More Power Users. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome.
David, you reminded me, people know we record these in advance, and so sometimes I lose track of the timeline, and it's happened to me. And so I also have like a holiday discount thing going on.
We do
collectively.
Yeah. Yes.
if you go to giverelay.com, we're doing a discount on annual memberships. So if you have somebody in your life that you want to give a membership for a relay show, if you want to give something to them, or you want to send it to, your significant other or your parents and they get you one, you can do all of that, giverelay.com. And More Power Users is, of course, there on the list.
On the menu.
Oh, you tied it back to the pizza thing. That's good.
I know, along with Daniel's excellent pizza.
Yeah, we're getting saucy.
Yeah, so More Power Users is the extended version of the show, ad-free and this week you're going to learn about pizza. Usually you learn about something nerdy in the after show.
Sounds good.
All right, Daniel. So I mentioned earlier some of the things you do, but tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, a bit about myself. I identify around my indie software company, Red Sweater. Been working on that, basically making Mac software for over 20 years now. So it's been a gradual change from when I was younger. I really identified with being an engineer at Apple. Just in summary, anyone who knows me online or in person knows I'm very, very Apple oriented. My kids the other day learned about the rumors, about the Apple making a self-driving car. And it's kind of a game they have. It's like, well, Dad's going to get one. So I've always been a big, big Apple fan, but I had the privilege of working for Apple from a very young age. I started my first contract job at Apple was when I was 18.
Oh,
and I felt like I managed to have a whole career at Apple, even though I quit when I was 26. So it was like, I was, spend a lot of time at Apple, went off on my own, started Red Sweater, started making apps. These days, I am sort of just back at the challenge and the thrill of trying to make my whole living from making and selling mainly Mac apps. So that's sort of the summary. And apart from that, I live in New England. I live in the Boston area. As you hinted at, I like to make pizza at home. I love playing guitar. I like going running. I'm an avid runner. And I'm a little bit of a smart aleck, as people quickly learn if they follow me on Twitter.
It's right there in your Twitter handle, which always cracks me up. So you were at Apple. I've heard your story before, being 18, working on projects at Apple. Like, just what was that like? I'm trying to think back when I was 18. Starting college. Like, I feel like in hindsight, still such a child in so many ways. Like, how did that come about, and what did you work on?
Well, I grew up in Santa Cruz, which is just, we call it over the hill from the Silicon Valley, which is where Apple is. San Jose / Santa Clara, Sunnyvale, all those little valley towns in California, south of San Francisco. Santa Cruz is the coastal town over the mountain range from there. So growing up where I did was a huge opportunity for me to get kind of connected with lots of different tech people. And I ended up being kind of associated with the whole nerd scene in Santa Cruz, and then to some extent, some overlap with like San Jose area. Long story short, I was actually going to school at UC Santa Cruz and was friends with people. Some of them were working at Apple, and I would have never thought in my wildest dreams, like, I'm just going to go get a job at Apple. But one of these people I knew said, they're always looking to hire people as QA testers on like a contract basis. And I was like, really? How do you do that? And they said, well, just go to this contract agency. It was a time at which I guess most of Apple was kind of booking all these jobs. It was the kind of thing where if they're coming out with a new version of a product, they might need suddenly like 5 times as many software testers. So they would ramp up and ramp down. And it was just like kind of knowing the right person and knowing to go into this contract agency. And, contract agency, for folks who don't know, is just like a highfalutin way of saying a temp agency. It's like, yeah, temp jobs are contracts too, but it's just basically a way to get part-time or temporary work. And I went in and I said, hey, I want to work at Apple. And they're like, okay. They asked me a few questions. I guess I kind of got the answers right. And the next thing you knew, I was testing on the System 7.5 Mac OS team. And it was just really lucky break because a lot of people who got these short-term testing jobs or, part-time, whatever, they would end up in the kind of, they had an area at Apple called Central Quality, which sounds like something out of a,
George
dystopian.
Orwell.
Yeah, George Orwell. Yeah, welcome to Central Quality. The quality will be ensured. But I was lucky to end up in an embedded quality job working with the engineering team. So like a bunch of developers, in other words. I was working with programmers who actually did the work on System 7.5. And that was a big lucky break for me because I didn't make a secret of the fact that I wanted to be a developer. I wanted to work on, coding. And luckily that team was so welcoming to me that it's not like it wasn't like a sure thing, but I was in the right place to be able to get the guidance and assistance to sort of figure out how to approach eventually applying for and then getting a job as an engineer in that team.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice. Did they take you under your wing to a certain extent?
Yeah, I mean, it was great. It was, yeah, as you can imagine, there's every different type of person in a group, with that. So some of the people were more like taking me under their wing, and some of them were more like trial by fire, like just, and some of my fonder memories actually are of some of the people who kind of, their method was just to give me really hard things to do. And so the one I like to tell the story about is one of my coworkers at that time, and this was stuff that they were just asking me to do in my spare time, like outside of work. It wasn't like things for the job. It was just like
you weren't on the clock. Yeah.
No, I was off the clock, and it was basically like, hey, I want to get good at this. So one guy says, okay, this app on the Mac called Simple Text. That's what they used to call the text edit, basically the equivalent of text edit today.
Yeah.
So he says, I want you to rewrite simple text using assembly language. And I was like, okay, what's, how? And it's like, he's like, you'll figure it out. So this is an example of like, it's almost like a phase of a kung fu training movie or something, It's
yeah. I wrote assembly language on Atari at the time, and it was hard. I mean, because it was binary. I mean, it was numbers. It wasn't even language. Wow, that's impressive.
I mean, in this case, it wasn't. There were instructions. You typed it out. Yeah. It was. But what was cool about it was it gave me a level of comfort with how the whole Mac toolbox and everything is put together, and how because it was kind of like having to dissect the whole frameworks of the Mac, figure out like, how does this work, which to the credit of that guy who gave me this task, it turned out to be very good for setting me up to confidently sort of apply to do the work that group was doing. And that was great. I mean, I've never been like overly confident about anything, to be honest. It's kind of funny because I think a lot of people I come across sometimes as being pretty confident, but it's really only the things that I've kind of come to recognize I actually can do. And at that time, I was really not confident, but I was like, I guess just bold enough to say, let me try to do this. And they gave me they basically gave me the test, and I ended up eventually getting a job in that group and worked there until right around the developer preview for Mac OS X was about to come out. And then I switched over to the Mac OS X team and worked on a group called Core Services, which is still a framework, still a group, I think. And worked on that for a few more years, and then I left Apple in 2002. So that's like 2 Mac Power Users appearances 20 years
Yeah,
ago.
man. Yeah, man. And then from there you went out on your own and you started Red Sweater.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. At the time, I had actually started Red Sweater technically as just like a little side thing. Apple was a lot less, at least a lot less obviously uptight about like people doing stuff on the side back then. So people knew at work that I had Red Sweater, was a little company I had started in San Francisco. Um, I was making a few little, shareware type things, we called them at the time. And then when I quit Apple, I actually quit in order to go back to school, but I started doing contract work at that time for programming, and I did that all through Red Sweater. And then so it wasn't until a few years later that I stopped doing the contract work and started focusing on the apps again.
Growing up in, the Valley, how was it that you latched onto Apple? Because there are so many great tech companies there, and there were a lot of stuff going on. What was it about Apple that sucked you in?
Oh yeah, it could have gone any number of ways. In fact, being such a nerd in such a highly connected place, there were other companies that I was very intrigued by. I used to drive up from Santa Cruz up through San Jose, up to Berkeley, Oakland area, and this drive on 880 in the Bay Area would take you by the huge Sun Microsystems offices. I think they're Tesla now. I think I might have that right. But I would fantasize about working at Sun, and in fact, one of my computers before I got a Mac was a Sun 3/50. I was full on in the Unix world as a teenager, and then into almost into adulthood. But then it was because of these connections with friends in Santa Cruz. A friend I knew who worked at Apple showed me the PowerBook Duo 210, and I was just in love with it. I was like, this is amazing. And I had never really used a Mac at that point. And but it convinced me. I wanted to switch to Mac, and that was it. So once I was using Macs, my interest in working for the other companies was less, and then just everything sort of coming together. I couldn't resist being a Mac user, happening to live 45-minute drive from Apple. That was great.
And of course, eventually the Unix stuff would come back around.
Yeah, it's funny, at Apple, I was one of the relatively speaking, one of the first people in the company to have a Unix email address, because when I started working there, everyone was still using an older pre-internet system called QuickMail. But they had, at the time, Apple had this sort of lesser known Unix system. And they had a system at work that we could get accounts on. And because I came into the company, I'm like, hey, I love Unix. Let's see what you got here. And so I got my Jalkut at apple.com at the time. And it was fairly unusual as the years went on to have an email address like that, because by default, Apple's one of those companies where by default, once they started giving everybody email addresses, they give it to you like, I should have been like Jalkda1 or something, but I had this just plain Jalkut at apple.com because I had just picked my own account on the Apple Unix server. And then that all got rolled over when everyone else started getting email.
That's cool.
Yeah, well, that's why they have Unix, right? Because of Daniel, right?
That's right. You're welcome. You're welcome.
We got to make the email work with Daniel, so let's just go ahead and add Unix. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure it was such an exciting time. I mean, just thinking the time frame from 7.5 to the early days of OS 10,
Yeah, it
You
was a
couldn't
big. Oh yeah,
you couldn't pick. Well, I guess you'd be hard pressed to pick a time frame that had more change, at least on the software side.
yeah, oh, absolutely. And it was also the existential time for the company. Like
Right.
when I got hired, I was hired full time as an employee in 1996.
Everyone knows great year for Apple.
Great year for Apple.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even believe they were hiring people. But
Sure.
the funny timing of it was I was hired, and then maybe 3 to 6 months later, they had massive layoffs, and I thought for sure I was going to get laid off because I was like the last one in, you know.
Mhm.
But I ended up being kept on. But at that time, I mean, I didn't really appreciate it as much at the time as I do in retrospect. But they were really like almost out of money, and so I was there when I was hired. Gil Amelio was the CEO. And I was there when Steve Jobs came back. I was there when the iMacs debuted. And so I kind of went from this on the edge of going out of business to, you know, iMacs coming out, Mac OS 10 coming out, and then finally the iPod coming out. And I got my iPod, the very first iPod. They didn't give everybody in the company an iPod, but they let everybody buy one for half price. So that's how I recall it. So I got my iPod, and then it was fairly soon after that that I left the company. But I got to see the company go from like almost out of business to selling iPods, which was a huge change, you know, over 6 years. It's amazing in retrospect.
Did you witness a culture change during that time? I mean, in hindsight, everybody must think that there was one, but that's not necessarily true. You know, I mean, the company
Mhm.
was in trouble, and then they were on the rise. But at the line level you were at, did anything really change?
It was a very interesting time because it was with the next acquisition. It was a culture, more of a culture blending than a culture change per se. Like a lot of next culture came into the company, but a lot of classic Mac sort of, you know, aesthetics and ideals persisted at the company. So some people inevitably felt left out, and I think left the company, or their values, their culture didn't persist. But
Yeah.
it really did change a lot, but kind of depended what group you were in. I think how much you noticed it being a change. And some groups were some. I think some groups, it was probably fair to say, sort of came from Next and really retained a lot of Next character, like the AppKit group uh, within, you know, the frameworks, you know, of the OS 10 division,
Yeah.
would have been a lot more Next culture, and some of the lower level groups that you know, like didn't get, you know, if you were working on like the hardware for the Mac, a Power PC or something, you weren't going to get a lot of influence from the Next side of things. So I think it did change a lot. But what I'm so impressed by, even after 20 years, and I mentioned this to you guys before we recorded, but like I don't know as much as I used to know about the company. But I'm so impressed after 20 years, and especially after 20 years of this massive success, how there's still quite a few people I know who are still working there. And there seems to be a lot of the same culture at the core. So that's for, as an Apple fan, that's sort of gratifying to me that they have managed to maintain that.
Yeah, you know, there's two companies I have a lot of friends that work for, and it's Apple and Disney. And I feel like they're similar in that there are people that go to those companies as a calling more than just a job. And so
Yeah.
long as the company doesn't blow it, they have the ability to keep really talented people a real long time.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely, and it was always the reputation at Apple that you weren't going to get paid the most money at Apple. You get paid a fair amount of money, you know, good, especially if in retrospect, some people got paid very well in terms of like stock compensation.
Sure.
Yeah, but it was never the place where if you were an engineer looking to for the highest bidder, you would never end up at Apple, you know. So it was the case that you sort of had to have a reason to want to work at Apple. And that was, I think it was frustrating in some ways to some people, maybe to me at sometimes, in the sense that you maybe don't always feel like you're getting everything you're owed per se. But, it meant that everyone who was there for probably something besides just the money.
This episode of MPU is made possible by 1Password. If you've ever forgotten a password or a login, you don't have to worry about that anymore, because with 1Password, you can store all of your credentials in addition to things like secure notes, credit card information, bank account routing numbers, everything in one safe, strong place. That's what 1Password is. It's a home for all of your secure information. You can use it to create strong, unique passwords that you can use out on the web and in applications. And the best part is you don't have to remember them because they're all stored in 1Password, easily available on all of your devices. If you're on a Mac, you can use Touch ID or the Apple Watch unlock. On an iPhone or iPad, you can use Face ID. It's with you wherever you are. With 1Password for families, you can share login information with the important people in your life. And with 1Password for teams, you can create 1Password vaults for different coworkers, managing access to critical information with fine-grained control. Of course, 1Password does work across a wide range of browsers and devices. No matter where I am in my life, I have access to all of my logins, all of that secure information. One of my favorite things and thing that I use pretty often is storing bank account information, where I need to give it to a sponsor or to a vendor so they can route money to us. Or it's one of those things, like, I don't want to dig out a check and find the numbers. I don't want to log in to the bank website and try to find the information. I just have it saved in 1Password. And with 1Password for teams, the people I work with have access to it as well. So head on over to 1password.com/MPU to learn more and to sign up for a free 30-day trial. Once you do, you'll get 20% off. That's 1password.com/MPU.
All right. So since it's only been 10 years since you've been on the show, I'm assuming you're still using all the same gear, right?
Yeah, I probably, it's funny. I didn't think about looking up my last appearance. I think it was like number 76 or something. I'm going to look it up right now because I feel
like
curious.
You're rubbing it in now. I feel like you're just rubbing it in.
76. David and Katie chat with developer Daniel Jalkut, who is 12 years old. No. This is so cool. It's funny. I have to say some of this stuff is really, really out of date, and some of it I am still using. Some of the stuff looking back 10 years ago includes, for example, Accessorizer, which was a little utility that I used to use to write little snippets of code for Objective-C. But there's other stuff. Audio Hijack Pro is on this list, and I am recording this right now as we speak in Audio Hijack. So some things change, some things stay the same.
Yeah. Well, what about your hardware? What has changed?
Everything has changed this year because of the Apple Silicon MacBook Pro. I don't have the slightest clue what I was using back then 10 years ago, but I can tell you with certainty I was not as excited about it as I am about this Mac that I'm recording on right now, because like so many Mac users, especially Mac Power users, these new M1 based MacBook Pros are just stunning. Like they tick so many boxes for those of us who've been waiting for a substantial update to the MacBook Pro line. So that's what I'm using. I got one of these MacBook Pro. I ended up going for the 14-inch. It was a little bit of a struggle deciding which size to get. Went for the 14-inch, but I went for pretty powerful. I got like 64 gigs of RAM, 64 GPUs, which I'll probably never use. GPU cores, I guess. Is it 64 or 32? I don't even remember, but I got a lot of power there, and I got the so-called M1 Max, and I ended up going with the 14-inch and then compromising on the size there by getting a monitor for the first time in a long time. So I've been.
So let me interrupt right there. So what went into your thinking between 14 and 16? I know a lot of listeners are writing us struggling with that same question.
It was tough. And in fact, I ordered the 16-inch at first, and then I had to make the painful decision to give up my fairly early delivery date.
Yeah.
So it's like, 16-inch, yeah, sure, go for it. And I got like a, at the time, few weeks earlier than some people date. And then I was like, you know what? I can't do the 16-inch. I sort of had been using the 16-inch Intel MacBook Pro. And when I stopped to think about it, I realized one of the things that didn't bring me joy about that was lugging the 16-inch around. It was not as fun. It's not nice for my needs. I realized, the things that were tugging at me were, one, I did want my portable computer to be as portable as possible. And two, at that point in time, I had committed to using a portable computer as my main computer. My sort of fixed view of how that was going to work was I was going to use the built-in screen. So it better be as big as possible. It better be 16 inches. And it was deciding to indulge myself with the possibility of a desktop monitor that pushed me towards saying, you know what, I'm going to get the 14-inch. I'm going to enjoy every portable aspect of this computer, and I'm going to figure it out on the desktop. I'll figure something out. And so I'm looking at the monitor right now. I ended up being pretty happy with, I know a lot of people are waiting for Apple to come out with a Pro like level monitor. And a lot of people have compromised with the 5K LG monitor. Mm-hmm. And I compromised even further with the 4K LG 24-inch monitor. So it's fairly small in terms of big monitors, but it is pretty good, in my opinion. So I'm feeling
it's a lot bigger than 16.
That's right. It's a lot bigger than 16, and being as small as it is while still being 4K. In other words, like, it's a lot tighter resolution than
pixel density is high.
Yeah, the pixel density is fairly high, and I'm happy with it. So it was about $700. Not nothing. It's a lot of money for just a monitor, but it is I think money well spent for this compromise I've made, and I have just been so happy with the MacBook itself. I have no complaints. And that's not my personality.
Now, as somebody who's been like not only working with Macs but writing on the Mac operating system in the past, I'm interested in your decision to be a only laptop guy. I mean, have you ever been a 2 Mac person, or how did you decide that you were going to try and pull it all off with one computer?
Yeah, I used to be a 2 Mac person for years, and all of that time, that was back when it was fairly difficult to maintain like a synchronization setup. You would have, over the years, I used different approaches, including like rsync or different
ChronoSync.
Different apps that do this kind of stuff. I never really got into because I'll just say, like, I got out of that lifestyle before. These days a lot of people just put everything on Dropbox or whatever. And I got out of that lifestyle before it was even easy to do a cloud-based thing. So basically at some point I just realized laptops were good enough power-wise. And in fact, back when I first started doing this, I did have an external monitor. So I had an external monitor, external keyboard, and I kind of did the clamshell life. And then over time, for some reason, I think what happened over time, the laptop monitors turned Retina, and I didn't have Retina monitors. So I ended up just using the laptop. I would put the laptop up on a stack of books and then use that 16-inch laptop screen as my whole monitor, which is small, but I got used to it. And But the trade-off for me was just knowing with 100% certainty at any time where all my stuff was, and it was always right on my MacBook. And I think I still want to keep that, because life is kind of complicated enough without having to wonder where your stuff is. And I just love being able to. I'm looking at my MacBook right now. I love the fact that I can grab that MacBook and go, and I know I have everything of digital importance to me, really.
So now it's been almost a year and a half since Apple first announced the switch to Apple Silicon, but it was rumored a lot before that. The whole laptop line now is on Apple Silicon, which is what you use. What is the biggest surprise to you with this transition? Being somebody who's watched this happen before.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I think Apple, whoever worked on the technology that they call Rosetta 2, which is the technology that makes the Apple Silicon Macs able to run Intel-based apps. Whoever worked on that should just feel really proud. And I think I haven't heard anybody say anything negative about Rosetta 2. So that's really unusual for a technological achievement to just have it be so widely met with acclaim. And the acclaim is almost understated because it just works. Most people don't even think about it. Us nerds who know that it's complicated to have a program that was compiled for an Intel chip just seamlessly run on a computer that doesn't have an Intel chip. We appreciate it. Everyone else just thinks, well, my apps still work. Of course they still work. So the biggest surprise to me is actually that it works quite as well as it does, and that it's as fast as it is. And even, there's very few shortcomings to the experience of running an Intel app on Apple Silicon Mac. I don't know if you guys have had that experience, but you really it says everything you need to know, that you usually have to go look in the system monitor to find out whether an app even is running natively or not.
Well, I got a good story on that. I'm not a huge gamer, but there's this one game that I've played for years. It's called Star Wars: The Old Republic. It's one of those online role-playing games. And yeah, I'm that guy who plays that. But I'm a Star Wars nerd, so I go in there once in a while and I have a little Jedi and I check out what's going on. And I have run that now successfully for a while in Crossover. Crossover is this weird app that interprets the Intel Mac code to the Intel Windows code. So it's literally a translation layer, translating from Mac into Windows on Intel hardware. And for a year or so now, they've been able to run this game, which means I don't have to run like, Parallels or a virtual Windows machine. So it's been great.
Yeah.
That is not translated to Apple Silicon. So now it is an Intel app running interpreted code to Windows that is now going through Rosetta to Apple Silicon. So it's getting translated twice now. And I get amazing frame rates. And it's just like, it's faster than a gaming Windows PC to me. And I don't, because I had a gaming Windows PC for a while that I was doing a screencast project, and I installed the app on there. It runs better on this double translation layer than it does on an actual Windows computer. So I can't get over it.
That's I've also looked at Crossover. It's and for folks who don't know, it's based on the open source Wine project.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting approach. It basically tries to provide all of the APIs that an app on Windows would call. It provides like its own implementation of it. I think that's how it works. But speaking of Crossover and VMware and Parallels and all this stuff, that is one of the most. That's, I think, one of the areas that people need to be most cautious about when they switch to Apple Silicon, because the fact is you can't run Intel Windows on VMware. the way you could on an Intel Mac.
Sure.
So those of us who got in the habit of being able to just, pop in VMware and boot up Microsoft Windows, it's not quite that simple. I think you can boot the ARM version of Windows, but I haven't tried that yet. But I have looked into some of these other solutions because I too have a couple random Windows things I need to run. And I would say my experience so far is the things I've run are not quite as good as they would have been in VMware, but it's just so amazing that they work at all. And the fact that there is a way forward there. But for some people and some apps, they should be aware that there's probably some apps that people are used to running in Windows that they'll have to get used to not being able to run. So that's one thing where, as much as I can say, like, Rosetta works so great, the system is awesome, it's powerful, et cetera, that's one area where if you've got like a advanced CAD program or something that you've been running in VMware, that's probably something to check out first before you make the leap.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of folks, we've heard from people that like have accounting software that's Windows based, or they'll put a Windows machine in the corner just to run a specific app. But in this case, it's a game. And honestly, if the game stopped working, it would probably be good for me if it stopped working. But I thought, well, I'll try it. What the heck? And I was shocked that it worked in crossover. I thought, well, they must have translated crossover to Apple Silicon already. And then I went in Activity Monitor and it says Intel. I'm like, wow, this is really impressive.
Yeah. That sort of technology, when we don't talk about it, like, that's the goal of the people who built it, I think, right? Be invisible, be transparent, and no one has to think about it, which is what Apple wants.
But I mean, I'm like cranking up the image quality and the frame rates, and it runs fine. But, granted, I have a vastly, massive M1 that I'm running on now. So,
right.
But anyway, yeah, it's impressive. I agree.
But Daniel, you do have a second Mac running around. You've got a Mac Mini on the shelf, don't you?
I do, yeah. In fact, now that Mac Mini, though, is also Apple Silicon. So I'm running out of Intel Macs very, very quickly, which is not the worst thing. But yeah, so I guess at some point along the line, my compromise became, I wasn't going to have a desktop Mac and a laptop Mac, but the nature of my work being so development oriented really lends itself to having a Mac that's just sort of on, an on-demand service provider Mac, also known as a build server, but I use it for a lot of things. So I use it as the build server. So that, for folks who don't know, that means like if I make some changes to an app I'm programming, I commit the changes and I push them. That means you basically upload them to your server that holds all your source code. And then typically a build server will then check out the code, copy the code back down to a computer, recompile it, run tests on it, do all this stuff to kind of make automated quality control. And as a single person company, it's especially important, I think, for me to find ways to, sort of increase the leverage I have with my limited time and, the things that the computer can help me to automate. I lean heavily into that. So I have a whole Mac that's just dedicated to basically running automated tests on my code, but it also serves as kind of like the house server. So there's these cool kind of power user features where if you have a Mac running in your house, you can set it up to like cache downloads from Apple. So you can have it so that if everybody in your house needs to update like their version of iOS, it'll go through the it'll cache it on like the home server. So I have it set up to do some things like that. It's sort of like my gateway to the world. Like if I need to, connect back to my Mac, so to speak, that kind of stuff all goes through that one computer. So it's a relatively small investment because I don't even need a monitor for that computer. It just hangs out in my basement really close to my internet connection, and it's just a Mac Mini. It just sits there plugged in with Ethernet right to my internet connection, and I connect to it through screen sharing. That's it.
Even in the Apple Silicon world with this powerful MacBook Pro at your desk, you still find it valuable to have another machine. It sounds like you don't want to bring it all onto one.
Yeah, I mean, and but that strategy was maybe rooted more in, feeling the limits of one computer before. But I wouldn't want to like knowingly give up any of the power of this great MacBook Pro, even if I wouldn't notice it most of the time. But it's funny you say that, because one of the great thrills of having this new computer now is, for the first time in years, I'm having that experience where there's so much headroom in terms of performance and like RAM and everything I use, that, as I'm recording with you, it's funny. If I was still using my Intel MacBook Pro, I would have restarted my Mac and like quit all the apps and all these kind of like ceremonial steps to make sure you don't like run into trouble.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I didn't do any of that, and I have like 20 apps running, and knock on wood, but I think that's going to be fine. And it's because I don't run into the limits of this Mac. But give me some time. I might. And then it's just nice. Whatever you're doing, the nice thing about offloading that kind of like menial update, running tests type stuff, is it just has zero impact on me in my workspace. It's something that's happening elsewhere. And so even if it was just a tiny performance degradation, just having it go on, it just has no place on my main Mac, if it can be easily done somewhere else. And it also has advantages. I tend to keep that build server at a fairly conservative OS release, so you'll run into this a lot if you talk to iOS developers in particular, or even Mac developers, but they'll say they can't like update to the latest Xcode because then they won't be able to distribute their app anymore, because you're supposed to use like the only the official version of Xcode. So I'm always living on the cutting edge with my main Mac. And then the conservative Mac Mini is there, just like completely reliable. So in addition to what I was saying about automatic tests and stuff, it's also the computer that generates any build of my apps that's going to go out to the public. So it's completely predictable. It's always running a predictable OS, a predictable Xcode, etc. And it's just nice to have kind of that mix of something that is all business, it just gets the job done. And then my main Mac, which I can run beta OSs on, I can take my own different risk profile there. That's kind of nice.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Text Expander from Smile. Go to textexpander.com/podcast to get 20% off and type more with less effort. I really believe Text Expander is the killer app for everyone. We're all familiar with the idea of text expansion. You type a few letters and a bunch of other letters immediately just blip in and replace a lot of typing for you. It's a basic feature in most operating systems, but the problem is that they sell it as a basic feature. Text Expander turns text expansion into an advanced feature because there's so much more you could do with just a little extra effort, and Text Expander goes to that effort at great length. For instance, let's say you're doing an email and you want the ability to just type in the person's name. With Text Expander, you can have a text expansion snippet that prompts you to type in the person's name. Another one would be the contents of your clipboard. Maybe you saved a special phone number or contract number or some complicated bit of text out of a different document that you want to drop in a text expansion. Well, you can't do that with all the basic text expansion tools out there, but Text Expander can grab the clipboard contents and put them in for you. Another common one is dates. You always want to insert dates into your snippets. Like when I send out bills, I want it to have the current month and the current year in the subject line. Text Expander does that for me. It just grabs the current date and month. It inserts them in. I don't have to manually do that. So all of the little pain points you have with text expansion, or all the reasons why you can't use it the way you really want to, those are solved with Text Expander. The team behind Text Expander really wants it to be the greatest text expansion app ever, and they're delivering on that. It's available on multiple platforms, the Mac, Windows, iOS, so you can get it wherever you need it. They have publicly available text expansion snippet libraries you can download if there's certain things that you want to make sure you get covered. When you use Text Expander, you can say the right thing in just a few keystrokes, and it's really better than copy and paste or scripts and templates. It is dynamic, it's there with you, and it's super easy to create and modify. And best of all, it works on any platform and any app, anywhere you type. So take your time back and increase your productivity. Go to textexpander.com/podcast and sign up now, and you'll get 20% off your first year. Once again, that's textexpander.com/podcast. Thank you, Text Expander, for all of your support of the Mac Power users. Daniel, before we went to the break, you were talking about that Mac Mini and other uses for it, and I know there's a lot of listeners that have an extra Mac Mini hanging around. What are some of the other things you're doing with it kind of as a power user?
Yeah, well, so one of the things is it's I said it was, in my basement hooked up to the Ethernet. It's also got a pretty sizable external hard drive plugged into it. And that is nice because it turns out to just be the almost infinite seeming capacity place to put stuff.
Yeah.
So I have that. There's also this other caveat of folks. A lot of folks use some kind of backup software, like I use Backblaze, and often these backup software cloud services, they let you back up anything that's like plugged into your Mac. Well, that Mac has plugged into it this giant hard drive, and then what I'm doing is I'm using that to like offload things that I don't want on my main Mac, but also to run Time Machine backups for myself and other people in my family. So having a kind of central place where it's kind of similar to the idea of offloading the CPU tasks of doing all the automated build testing. It's offloading the archive task of just kind of keeping a bunch of stuff. And I feel pretty good about it because I'm basically backing up to this central Mac Mini that is then in turn being backed up to Backblaze. And so I think that anything that kind of like gives you a kind of sense of permanence. It's also the fact that like the great thing about a portable like the MacBook Pro is you can take it anywhere, but that means there is a chance you're going to lose it, right? So
Yeah.
the Mac Mini, is very unlikely to get lost. It could suffer, from a natural disaster or something, but it's got a real clear, stable place, and it's likely to stick around.
Yeah, and if that's of interest to you, dear listener, episode 465, the Mighty Mac Mini, Stephen and I kind of went in great detail about all the things you can do with a Mac Mini, which I feel like it has even new life with these. I was about to say Intel guys.
Yeah,
it has even more new life with this new Apple Silicon Macs. Because it's like it just gives it gives it wings, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, there was a time there, you all remember, that everyone was worried that Apple was going to abandon the Mac Mini.
Oh
right?
Yeah.
And it was like, wasn't that the famous "it remains a product in our lineup"?
Yeah.
And that was like the most anybody could get Apple to say about the future of the Mac Mini. And so when it came out with, I think it was, if I'm remembering right, it had like a kind of a glorious last Intel update a few years ago, and then when it came out with the Mac Mini or with the Apple Silicon, everyone was just like, well, this is great. It still has all the ports, it has, this great new chip. Obviously now people, I think, are curious about like a Mac Mini Pro or something, but yeah, it's a really cool, really versatile little computer. Uh, and I know some people would really love to see something even smaller, even more sort of puck sized. But it's a really great way to just get a good Mac into a place where it needs to be.
Now, if you wind back the clock a few years ago, during the times you were in the wilderness and not on MPU, I don't know, once again, it's all
I must have
Steven's
been
fault.
missing in action, right? Yeah.
And it's all Steven's fault. But there was this time where we had all these guests on where the show would start. I'd ask people about their hardware, and we'd inevitably hear my keyboard on my laptop failed, or there's always some problem with an Apple laptop. That was how we started every show for like 3 years, and now I feel like we're kind of out of that, but we're in a different wilderness now where the underlying programming calls for the Mac are a little bit kind of up in the air. So I'm going to summarize as best as I can, but I'd like you to kind of chime in with me here. First of all, we've got, the historical, app kit, which is where you build applications. It's the stuff that existed when you were back at Apple, and it's been part of Mac OS X for the whole time. So that's the first one, right?
Yep.
Okay, and then you've got Swift UI, which Apple has announced a few years ago, which is kind of meant to ultimately be the replacement for that. I mean, I guess I'm not sure if they've said that yet, but it seems like that's where they're heading.
Yeah, I think that's strongly hinted.
Yeah, and then they've got Catalyst, which is the ability to take your iOS and your iPad app and put it on the Mac, which is kind of somewhere in between those two. And then we've got this growing movement for people making apps, largely Electron, but there's also other technologies involved where you make an app one time on some third-party utility, and then you can distribute it to the iPhone and the iPad and Android and Windows and wherever you want to put it. And so we've got all of these competing platforms now, and it hasn't always been that way, right? I mean, for most of your career, it's just been AppKit.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was at Apple also when they did that huge transition from the classic Mac OS frameworks to AppKit. And that was a very disruptive time for existing Mac developers. Like at that time, so for folks who don't know, AppKit was the Next technology, came from Next. So before Apple acquired Next, there was no AppKit at Apple. It was all based on these frameworks that ended up being called Carbon. They used to just be called the Mac Toolbox, was the traditional name for it. So at that time, when OS X was first coming out, AppKit was still relatively unused, and so it was back then, like around, let's say the year 2000. That was about, you could look at AppKit back then, and as far as most Mac developers were concerned, it was about as new as things like Swift UI are now. And so at that time, you look at a company like Adobe, they were not going to switch away from Carbon to AppKit.
Yeah.
But then the one thing that was nice, though, was it was fairly clear. I mean, there were times when it was less clear, but there was a linear progression that Apple laid out. It was kind of obvious to most people that AppKit and Cocoa, as they dubbed the whole system, was going to be the future for Apple app development, for Mac app development.
Right.
And so you some people could be in denial and say like, well, Cocoa, Carbon forever, it's never going away. But most people kind of got the memo. It's like, yeah, I think it is going away, and this is what's replacing it. And so what's so different now is, like you said, it's not totally obvious what's replacing AppKit, or even if AppKit is being replaced. It's not nearly as obvious. And I think you did a good job summarizing it. We got we have all of the Apple options, which, like you said, there's basically 3 right now: AppKit, Swift UI, and Catalyst. But then, complicated by the fact that there's web-based desktop app solutions like Electron, but then also just the web itself, just using, just running stuff in the browser
Yeah.
let's face it, is the most successful application platform of all time. I
Mhm.
mean, that's it. That's it. It's one as far as a broad definition of app platform. So somebody looking today to make a new app of any kind, they have to decide between all these pros and cons. And I wish it were more straightforward. And I feel like a lot of people are frustrated that Apple hasn't done a better job. First of all, of just sort of differentiating the native experience from the web-based experience in a way that makes it more clear to people. Like, why would you want to keep doing this? But then, second, that their native offerings are so divergent from one another. And
Yeah.
you summarized it in terms of the Mac, but the same thing applies. With you substitute UIKit in for AppKit, and the same things apply sort of on iOS. People don't know what to do on iOS either.
Yeah, and the sad thing is developers, I mean, my heart goes out to them because you've got to make a decision where are you going to invest all your time and money. Like AppKit is more stable right now, and but the time you spend on AppKit, there's a very good chance in a few years that stuff's not going to work and you're going to have to redo it all. UIKit is supposedly the future, but it's super broken and it's missing features. So it's like a lot of pain to work in it now.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what the answer is. And also, power users are going to give you a beating no matter what you do, because if you use AppKit and you don't get the latest and greatest features showing up for Swift UI, they're going to be mad. If you use Swift UI and features don't work because Apple hasn't sorted out yet, they're going to get mad. If you go to Electron, they're definitely going to get mad. So it's like, I don't know what you're supposed to do. And I do think as users, we need to give the developers a little patience as we sort through all this stuff.
Well, I will say a couple things. I don't think it's clear. Like I was saying, it was sort of becoming obvious that Carbon was going to be out of date at some point. I don't think it's yet totally clear what the story is for AppKit, and to the extent that I wouldn't say that investing in AppKit today is investing in something that's not going to be supported in a few years. Like, I don't know that that's true, and that's what part of what makes it so kind of fuzzy right now. The other thing is, at this point, I don't know of many, if any, features exist that developers can only reasonably provide to users with Swift UI or Catalyst. I mean, there's kind of some edge case things like, well, if you want to run certain iOS only interfaces, then yeah, you have to use Catalyst if you want that to run on a Mac. But in general, I would say AppKit is still in a position to provide superior apps across the board. Everything that people like about Swift UI and Catalyst is the extent to which it serves the developer, not the user. It might be a little bit of an overstatement, but I think that's approximately right. It's not like a developer using Swift UI gets you this amazing new experience that is can't be imitated by AppKit. It's more that it makes it more approachable for the developer to make a cross-platform app. It's not like using Catalyst makes it so you can develop the greatest Mac app. It's that it lets some developers have a Mac app at all without going through all the work of making an app from scratch. So I think the situation we're in right now, if any developer had infinite time, which I know obviously it's a non-existent thing, nobody has infinite time, but if you did, I don't see how you wouldn't choose AppKit right now, just because it is the framework that lets you provide all of the functionality that a Mac user could want. Now, everything else, like I said, there's trade-offs. And if you need to support iOS and the Mac, maybe using Swift UI or Catalyst is the right trade-off, but it's not a trade-off that really benefits users directly, except to the extent that it allows a developer to justify being available on one platform or more.
Thank you for sharing that, because I honestly have been confused from the outside as to what we should be telling people, because we hear from listeners about this all the time.
I am a little biased towards AppKit, but it's not for lack of trying to appreciate Swift UI. I do appreciate Swift UI. It's just not progressing as fast as I thought it might. Actually, Swift itself makes a good contrast, because Swift, when it first came out, what is it now? 7 years? I don't know. It's been a while.
Something like that.
Yeah. When it first came out, it was simultaneously amazing and infuriating. Developers on the Mac immediately ran into so many shortcomings. And then it was also changing so quickly. People who embraced Swift in the first few years found themselves having to rewrite or migrate their code repeatedly. But it did change very fast. And I don't have any reservations now recommending that developers use Swift. So as a language, that's an example of something that Apple introduced, completely disrupted their own platform, and then proceeded to iterate on it at such a rate that that I think they've succeeded. It's a success. Now, there's some people out there who don't like Swift and who would prefer Objective-C, but I don't think, even if they don't like it, I don't think they can argue that Swift hasn't, it's achieved its goals. And that's not quite true yet for Swift UI. And I feel kind of like I would have wanted to see a trajectory more like Swift's trajectory, in that like each year being kind of blown away by upgrades. And I'm not trying to, put down the Apple teams that are working on this. It's just, as it turns out, you get what you get done, what you can get done, and what has gotten done doesn't yet compel most developers of suitably complicated Mac apps to want to just like run to Swift UI.
Right. And thinking about that, the Carbon time frame, I remember Apple making a big deal that the Finder was built with Carbon, and then eventually they rewrote the Finder to be Cocoa and leaving Carbon behind. And I think that in particular was sort of the canary in the coal mine for a lot of developers. As we sit here today at the end of 2021, Swift UI is only 2 years old, 2.5 years old. And we've just now seen the first major Mac app from Apple be built with it, and that's Shortcuts. And Shortcuts launched with a lot of issues related to the UI. And so I do try to encourage people to remember that this is not a perfect analogy to the past, but also these things take time. And just because Swift is X years old or Swift UI is X years old doesn't necessarily mean much until we start to see Apple embrace it. Contrast Swift UI with something like Catalyst, which Apple has embraced on the Mac. The Maps app, Messages, and others have become Catalyst apps based on the iPad OS code base and design, but coming to the Mac and being Macified in a way. And so I really look at what is Apple doing with this to be an indicator of maybe where the things are going. But Apple's moving very slowly, right? I would imagine that 90-something% of the projects that make up Mac OS are still AppKit. And I think it's going to take time for this to happen. So Daniel, I agree with you. I think that AppKit is still has plenty of time left. And, even just looking at Apple's responsibilities as a developer, these other tools aren't there yet. And they're pushing on them. And I think Swift UI will be a lot better because the Shortcuts team chose it to build out the new version of Shortcuts for the Mac. But I don't think AppKit's, expiration date is anytime super soon.
Right. And in fact, when you see people sort of pushing back at Apple on Swift UI, a lot of times folks from Apple will say Swift UI is not intended to supersede anything yet. So they will actually even endorse this approach of sort of falling back to the native framework where you need to. And in some ways, I think that is the way forward, is to say, hey, if you can get some value out of Swift UI today, for, let's say, the main window of your app, or let's say maybe better to say, like, if you can, for instance, like renovate your app's preferences window with Swift UI, and it makes it a lot easier for you to manage, it looks nicer, whatever. There's some benefits to that. Go ahead and do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need to, renovate the main window, or, let's say, taking Adobe as an example, if they were going to, say, change a preferences panel over to Swift UI, that might be a lot more approachable than changing the whole drawing canvas over.
Yeah, and that's what we're hearing. I mean, talking without naming names, I'm talking to developers now who are working for new updated Mac applications, and most of them are taking a hybrid approach. They're trying to start to incorporate Swift UI, but they're absolutely still using AppKit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the way to, the trick for developers is usually to not get too excited and to, don't abandon all the old stuff right away, but try to design stuff, even if you're using quote unquote old stuff, design it so that it will be ready to transition to something else. And, I guess if there's a silver lining on the fact that Apple's giving us so many choices and sort of conflicting messages in some ways, it's that it does encourage us to make our code sort of adaptable. So, the stuff that makes an app the app is mostly unique to each developer. So if you can package that in a way that you'll be able to easily or relatively easily switch it from one framework to another, that's good for you, and ultimately it'll make you, like if AppKit disappears in, let's say, 10 years, I would like to hope that I would have a pretty easy time switching things over to whatever's next. And I'm not going to get too worried about sticking with AppKit while I feel like I need to, because I see these people just spending too much time trying to be on the bleeding edge of things, and I do that sometimes. But sometimes it's also better just to ride the stable old reliable framework.
This episode of Mac Power Users is brought to you by Electric. Say that you have a whole fleet of Apple devices. They probably used to be arranged neatly, carried to and from the office predictably, handed directly to team members on their first day, and used precisely for work, securely connected to the office network. Well, today's different. Now they're strewn across the land. Your company iPads, iPhones, and Macs are out there connecting to dodgy coffee shop Wi-Fi, being left behind on flights, moonlighting as child's toy in playrooms turned work-from-home offices. What could go wrong? Well, thanks to Electric, you don't have to worry about what could go wrong. They give you fully supported device management for Apple devices. Electric Device Management automates device provisioning and setup, remotely enforces security and compliance across your fleet, and gives you visibility into your device inventory and health at all times. Electric uses the world's leading mobile device management providers and tops it off with world-class IT support for fully managed devices. And they have over 100 IT specialists ready to field your team's IT requests. So stop stressing about scattered devices. Head on over to electric.ai/MPU to get started. And for taking a qualified meeting with their team, they're going to give you a pair of Beats Solo 3 wireless headphones. That's electric.ai/MPU to get your free pair of Beats Solo 3 wireless headphones today when you schedule a meeting. Our thanks to Electric for their support of the show.
So Daniel, we've been getting through the show. We're quite a long time, and we haven't even talked about any of your apps. I want to take a minute to look at the stuff that you are currently actively developing for the Mac and talk about it. The first, which is an app that both Stephen and I have used, is Mars Edit.
Yeah, Mars Edit is it's funny. I don't want to keep hammering on this 10 years thing, but I think 10 years ago was more. Let's see. I guess it's been more than that now. I've been actively developing Mars Edit since 2007. Now that I think of it, and I originally acquired Mars Edit from another well-known Mac developer, Brent Simmons. And it's just been kind of one of my true software loves for these past almost 15 years now. It's you guys know what it is, but it's a blog editor app. So I usually describe it as an app for people. It's kind of like a mail client is to something like Gmail. Mars Edit is to something like WordPress. So it's an app that you run on your Mac to make it easier to write, publish, manage your posts on the web.
Because you should never write a blog post on WordPress if
That's
you
right.
don't want to inevitably lose a lot of work.
It's funny that the web. I have to give the web development community, the web browser community, a lot of credit, because over the past 20 or so years that everyone has repeatedly said, do not write text in web browsers. They have increasingly improved web browsers to the point that a lot of times when you think you've lost text in a web browser, you haven't. But inevitably, people still seem to keep managing to find ways to write text in a web browser and then lose it all. So I do tend to still agree. Don't write long bits of work in a web browser if you can avoid it. And Mars Edit is certainly one option for folks who want to have a place to write their blog posts and save them locally, know that you have a safe, locally saved copy, and then put them up for everyone to see when they're ready.
I use it every single day. It's on my dock right here.
Awesome. And it's AppKit, all AppKit, beautiful AppKit.
And then you also just updated, I think my favorite app that you make is Fast Scripts, and we just got version 3 of that. And
Yeah.
I'll explain that one to folks. So, you know how Apple has this amazing scripting language called AppleScript, and it allows you to do a lot of automation on your Mac. I feel like the AppleScript team did an amazing job embedding AppleScript into the Mac, giving you the ability to add automation to applications and tie things together that you wouldn't be able to if you weren't able to use AppleScript. But I feel like where they went to lunch early was in the implementation. Like, you know, getting these scripts to run, like you save it as an app to your desktop, or, I mean, what do you do to get these scripts to run short of opening the script editor and running them? And Daniel solved the problem with Fast Scripts. He put a thing in the menu bar, you put your favorite scripts up there, and they just run. And that's an app that I use every day. And how did you come up with the idea for Fast Scripts?
Yeah, it's funny. It's such a blunt name, Fast Scripts. It's like a cave person just, said to me, want fast scripts, That's, I think, how I was feeling at the time. I wrote this app originally. I think I started working on it in 2000 or so, 2001. It was while I was still working at Apple. And I remember I had a Christmas break off for the holidays. And I was just so excited to have some time to work on something on my own. And at that time, for whatever reason, I was looking at Fast Scripts, or I was looking at AppleScript, intrigued by AppleScript, but so frustrated. It seemed like it was designed for people, and this is a very important market. It was designed for people who wanted to be able to open up a script that would say, automate like the typesetting of a 300-page book. And so you open it up in script editor and you'd set up the beautiful script and you'd run it, and 3 hours later you'd have your typeset book, let's say. And I know that was a huge market and still is a huge market for AppleScript and automation in general. But the kinds of things I wanted to do with scripts were things that wouldn't save me 3 hours at one sitting, but that would save me 10 seconds, like hundreds and hundreds of times, again and
Yeah.
again. And there was no way that I could find on the Mac at that time to achieve this. I don't remember the specifics, but I think at that time you did have to open the script in Script Editor and then run it. And since then, Apple has a script menu of their own. But I don't think at that time when I made Fast Scripts that they even had a script menu. Fast Scripts was sort of inspired by an old Mac OS 9, Mac OS 7, 8, 9 app that was called, I think it was called OSA menu. And all that did, quote unquote, all that did was put a icon in the menu bar that you could select a script from and it would run it. And I thought that's what Mac OS 10 needs. And so I just made that at first. And the breakthrough then was I could be, for instance, in my text editor. And this was also before the time of anything like Text Expander or anything like that. I could be in a text editor, for example, and I could select some text, and then I could just go click in the menu bar and say, let's say, capitalize this text, and you can imagine how different that workflow is from having to say, go switch to Script Editor, open up a script called capitalize text, tell app text edit to capitalize, whatever, So for me, that was really the key. Was I made Fast Scripts. I remember that having that feeling. There's no way to run short scripts, basically, because it would take like 20 seconds or something just to load up the script and run it. And so that now I'm remembering another major design goal for Fast Scripts at the time was not only would it load all your scripts from your script menu, from your script folder, it would keep them all in memory. So it made a point of loading, preparing the script, and being ready to run it at a moment's notice. And that was where a lot of the time savings was, because when you loaded it in Apple's script editor, it would have to load it and compile it and run it each time. And so it's funny, that was like the major distinguishing feature of Fast Scripts and what I thought warranted calling it fast.
Yeah.
And now fast forward 20 years, the latest version, Fast Scripts 3, this is a good example of having to sort of adapt to the times, because that speed bottleneck is not the same anymore. So with Fast Scripts 3, quite the opposite. Nowadays, in Fast Scripts 3, one of its selling points is whenever you select a script, it launches a whole separate app from scratch to run the script in isolation, separate from the main app. So it's like a complete turnaround from what my priorities were at the beginning, but it's still lightning fast because the OS has changed, hardware has changed, the way everything works has changed.
The overhead now exists to make it a separate instance, but that gives you an additional benefit.
That's right. Yeah. And so now now with Fast Scripts 3, which just, as you said, just came out, it lets you run as many of these scripts at once as you want to, whereas before I was always limited to one script at a time. But it's still the same basic idea. And then over the years, of course, a major feature of it now is that you can assign keyboard shortcuts. So really going to the script menu is something I only do every once in a while. But being able to put keyboard shortcut on it, so like so many other apps out there that achieve similar things, Keyboard Maestro is a great example. Being able to give a keyboard shortcut to a task that would otherwise take you longer or be more tedious than if you could just automate it.
This is the first version of Fast Scripts that's not in the Mac App Store. Do you have anything to add to that other than the normal Mac App Store stuff?
It's so funny because Fast Scripts was only in the App Store because of my eagerness to jump into the App Store as soon as it debuted. Because if you remember back to when Apple started the Mac App Store, it was before so-called app sandboxing was introduced. So in retrospect, it was really awkward timing for Apple because they came out with the Mac App Store. They said, everybody come into the Mac App Store. It's great. It's a great place to sell your Mac apps. A bunch of us said, great, we're in. And I included fast scripts in that. And then about a year later, they said, by the way, everything needs to be sandboxed. And that immediately changed what was qualified to be in the App Store. But they said, we understand there's already some apps in there that aren't sandboxed. So they're going to be allowed to stay in, but only for bug fixes, which was this very amorphous, standard. Somehow I ended up leaving fast scripts in the store for the next 10 years. I at first I was really diligent, quote unquote, only doing bug fixes. But then as the years went on, I was like adding fairly substantial new features here and there. I think it's possible nobody works at Apple in the App Store who knows anymore that there are these weird non-sandboxed apps. But with FastScripts 3, I knew I wanted to charge an upgrade fee, and I knew that I wanted to basically make it a new app. And that I knew that I couldn't present to Apple the same app that is already in the App Store, but as a new app, that they wouldn't approve it. So that was what cemented my decision to leave the App Store. I could still technically open up the old version again for sale on the App Store, but I think it's just time to make a clean break. And just to clarify for folks, the reason FastScripts can't be sandboxed is it needs to do so many subtle nuanced things with the execution of scripts that just don't fit in the sandboxed rules.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what the script does. I mean, you're going to need access to stuff to run the script.
That's true, and but there's many dimensions to it as well, because even just having the access to read the scripts in from the conventional location would require special permission. So
it's like you're like Lando Calrissian. This deal just gets worse all the time.
It really does. It really, and I'm not even a person who's against sandboxing. All my other apps are sandboxed. Mars Edit is also in the App Store, and it technically had that same provision where it could have stayed sandboxed indefinitely. But I saw that it was more reasonable to sandbox it, so I sandboxed it. And I think there's a lot of good reasons to sandbox software, but when sandboxing it literally makes it useless, I think that's where we have to draw the line. So happy to sandbox when it makes sense, but if not, then I'm just going to try to make the app as useful as possible.
All right, so Daniel, you've been an app developer, a Mac app developer for 20 years. You worked inside Apple for several years. If Tim Cook called you and said, Daniel, I'm going to grant your 3 wishes. I'm going to be your genie. To fix the Mac App Store, what are the 3 things that you would do?
The first thing, I'm not even going to claim that these are necessarily the right order or priority. I'm just going to tell you what comes to mind first. First of all, allow developers to proactively grant refunds to customers. Second, allow developers to provide, bona fide, straightforward trial period to customers. Currently, we have to jump through hoops to try to achieve anything like that. And then third, I would say an officially supported paid upgrade mechanism, because
sure,
everything has gone towards subscription-based software, and maybe that is the future. And I'm not going to deny it if an opportunity to make subscription software presents it to me and it seems like the best choice, I'll take that. But it's not the way we've been doing things for a long time. A lot of us still want to sell software with the option of a paid upgrade. And the fact that Apple doesn't support it well, it just makes it so confusing for people. I kind of jump through hoops to provide something akin to paid upgrades, and it confuses people. I'm glad I'm able to do it, but it's confusing. The side effects are that, for example, my app has to be listed in the App Store as a free app. And so people always get confused. They think it's free, then it's not. And then, if they download the free app, Apple says they paid for it when they didn't. It's just all confusing. You guys know all about that. But I guess those are the three things that jump to mind for me. I think that the usability of the App Store for most users is fantastic. And who wouldn't want to just be able to log into a new Mac and say, yeah, download all my apps? That's so much easier than anything any third party really can reasonably provide. But if we're not able to sort of replicate the same business user relationship that we have outside the App Store, that's just going to be a constant struggle.
It's interesting to the listener that I just thought of that question as I asked it. We didn't, this is not in the outline, but you immediately had three things. You didn't require any consideration. It was so...
That's why I said that, I'm not sure those are the top three or anything. It's just, but you're right. We didn't have any preparation for that. That's just three because I've been mulling over problems with the App Store for 10 years. It's not hard for me to come up with three.
Now, one other app you have that I think folks should know about is Black Ink, and it's the crossword weapon of choice on the Mac. And how did you get into making a crossword app?
Well, this is a funny one, and it's kind of funny. My history with crosswords goes back to Apple. Speaking of those early days working at Apple, we had this great pastime that, starting in about 1996, a bunch of people would come into my office and we would sit around and group solve the New York Times crossword puzzle together. And we used the app called Across Lite, which was and is one of the standard sort of crossword solving apps out there. Fast forward to the year 2017. No, 2007. I get these decades wrong. 2007, I was actually in the process of acquiring MarsEdit from Britt Simmons. And I don't want to go too long on this, so I'll just summarize it. Basically, circumstances led me to make a blog post that said, I want somebody to sell me an app for $5,000. And it was based on this like public issue that was going down at the time where somebody had gotten sort of ripped off for $5,000. I said, come on, sell me an app for $5,000 and I will actually pay you. And I got like 20 or 25 offers. And they're very interesting offers from all across the spectrum. And one of them was this developer who happened to live in the same area, New England. And he said he wanted to sell me this app called Mac Xword. And I thought back to those times when I had spent, solving the puzzles at Apple. And I hadn't really been into crosswords as much at that point, but I thought, you know what, this could be a lot of fun. Like I obviously love crosswords. I had also done a lot of crossword solving as a kid. There's like an aesthetic, intellectual kind of, cultural affinity there. So partly to just sort of fulfill this weird transaction of like wanting to acquire something for a relatively small amount of money and then breathe life into it. And partly because I had a true passion for crosswords, I acquired this app. At the time, put it in perspective, it was 100% Java based.
Wow. Okay.
And this is another historical blip, in the Apple history of Apple's frameworks. When they started marketing AppKit to developers, they presented it as a two-forked road. You could either program in Objective-C or in Java. And a lot of people took the Java route, and that was unfortunate for them because it was one of the examples of Apple actually having more choices than they should have. And they ended up eventually basically getting rid of Java for Mac apps. So I ended up acquiring this app, converted it to Objective-C, put a kind of a fresh coat of paint on it and started selling it. And it's been just kind of one of my beloved like side project apps almost. I use it nowadays. I solve the New York Times puzzle every day. And like you said, it's just for a lot of people, it is the weapon of choice for solving crosswords on the Mac. And it's, if you like crosswords, again, it's kind of a trend of my apps offering desktop alternatives to things that a lot of people do in a web browser. And a lot of people go into a web browser to solve the New York Times, to solve other newspapers' puzzles. And this is an opportunity to solve puzzles like that, but in a native Mac app.
I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I so much wanted to talk to you today about the state of all these programming environments, because in my head, you are like one of the best Mac developers, and that's been your focus this whole time. I mean, you don't have a lot of stuff you're making for iPhone and iPad. You are a Mac developer.
You're right, and I mean, I've dipped my toes into the iOS world repeatedly and for a long time, and I have stuff in the works. I mean, I've been public about some of it. Like I do have a public test flight for Black Ink. Speaking of Black Ink, I have an iOS version that is
nice.
That people can try.
I didn't even realize that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
I haven't been promoting it a lot, and it's another sort of like pattern of my developer productivity over the past few years has been, taking quite a while to finally complete things. And so, for instance, FastScripts 3 being out, I think I ran into you guys both in WWDC San Jose like 2.5 years ago, and I was basically talking about it like FastScripts was going to be out next month, and it's things just take a while. So, but Black Ink for iOS is closer to being shipped than a lot of my iOS stuff, and I also have my eye on a Mars Edit port to iOS.
Yes.
But I have to say, one of the things that's so nice about the Mac is being able to charge $40 for an app and people don't laugh you off of the screen,
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things I think a lot of traditional desktop developers of like productivity apps in particular have trouble with iOS, how to position the app so that they both make enough money from it to make it worth their while, and that the customer base doesn't see it as ridiculously out of bounds as far as price goes.
Yeah, I don't know how that got started. The idea that $5 is a ridiculous amount of money for an app, but
right,
it is a thing on the iPhone.
Yeah, so I think speaking of, as I venture into iOS, that might be where I start to experiment with a subscription approach, because the fact of the matter is subscriptions annoy a lot of people, but human nature being what it is, people are more willing to swallow a sustainable fee when it's trickle at a time, dollars per year instead of tens of dollars all up front. So that might be where I try it out. As I go into iOS, I think I'm going to be probably a little defiant about pricing and just say, you know what, this is how much I need to get paid, and hopefully some people will choose to pay for it.
This episode of the Mac Power Users is brought to you by Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com/MPU and make your next move, and enter offer code MPU at checkout to get 10% off your first purchase. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build your online presence and run your business. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, they've got it all covered. Squarespace combines cutting-edge design and world-class engineering, making it easier than ever to establish your home online and make your ideas a reality. Squarespace has everything you need to create a beautiful and modern website. You start with a professionally designed template and use drag and drop tools to make it your own. With Squarespace, you can customize the look and feel and the settings, the products you have on sale, and more with just a few clicks. And all Squarespace websites are optimized for mobile. so your content automatically adjusts so it will look great on any device. With Squarespace, you'll get free unlimited hosting, top-of-the-line security, and dependable resources to help you succeed. There's nothing to patch or upgrade. They have award-winning 24/7 customer support if you need any help, and they'll even let you quickly and easily grab a unique domain name, so you don't even have to monkey around with that. Plus, you'll have everything you need for SEO and email marketing to get your ideas out there. There is so much you can do with Squarespace. You can turn your big idea into a new website, or showcase your work, or publish your next blog post, or promote your business, or announce an upcoming event, and much more. I became a Squarespace believer, something like 10 years ago, because I got tired of having to manage the MacSparky website, and the plugins would get corrupted, and it always seemed like there was a problem. Switching to Squarespace just solved it for me, and I've been a very happy customer ever since. So why not head to squarespace.com/MPU for a free trial with no credit card required. And when you're ready to launch, use the offer code MPU to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. That's squarespace.com/MPU. And when you decide to sign up, use the offer code MPU to get 10% off your first purchase and show your support for the Mac Power users. Our thanks to Squarespace for their support of the Mac Power users and all of Relay FM.
Daniel, we like to close these guest interviews with maybe some favorite apps and services that you use that have made their way into your workflow, but we haven't been able to touch on yet. What comes to mind?
Well, it's funny. I mentioned how I acquired Mars Edit from Brent Simmons, and I think it's worth mentioning for folks who don't already know. Probably most of your audience knows, but that his very well regarded RSS reader, NetNewsWire, has had a glorious revival over the past few years, and it's unusual, in my opinion, for a few reasons. One, that it's completely open source, but like top notch Mac app. So it's an unusual situation where this beautiful, modern, highly performant, thoughtfully designed app is also something anybody can contribute to. So it's an example of an app that's always running on my Mac, that I kind of find like I have a little affinity for it also. It's like a member of the family, right? But a little bit of trivia, Mars Edit, not only did I acquire it from Brent Simmons, basically, but Mars Edit started out as a feature of NetNewsWire. And Brent decided to spin it off, almost 20 years ago into a separate app. So there's sort of, I think we still have a little bit of like aesthetic and functional. We see things the same way. And I like NetNewsWire for that reason, partly. So it's been great for me because for a while I was kind of getting out of the habit of using RSS again because there wasn't a lot of the other apps. They're great apps out there, but none of them was really scratching the NetNewsWire itch for me. And it's great to have like a fully modern back in action NetNewsWire that I use. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I knew this was coming, so I started looking through my apps folder, and I remembered also looking back at my last appearance on the show. There was some funny old stuff like MAMP, MAMP, and it's funny to see that I'm still so interested in some of the same things. But MAMP back then, it was, and I think still is, it's like an environment for running, like basically like Linux on your Mac. And these days, I'm really jazzed about Docker. And I think Docker is something a lot of web developers know about, but I think a lot of power users could really benefit from it if they don't already know about it. And are either one of you kind of familiar with or use Docker?
I'm familiar with it, but I have not like dove in the pool. Well, tell us explain what it is for all of us.
Sure. Well, so Docker takes this idea of basically, it's kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier with running things like Wine or Crossover. The thing that's brilliant about Docker is it takes the idea of all the rules and steps that would build a custom like server instance of any kind. And gives a kind of a standard environment for rebuilding and running those things. And so the reason I think it's really useful for not just for developers, but for power users is it gives you the tools to run not just arbitrary like apps or services, but arbitrary apps and services in an arbitrary environment. Like, I know that's kind of makes it kind of hard to understand, but just as an example, let's say you are a power user who really loves Emacs, but for whatever reason, the version of Emacs that you love only works with like a version of Red Hat Linux from like 5 years ago. Docker gives you the ability to basically bring up like whatever version of whatever OS you want, or a simulation of it, basically a stand-in for it, and to install whatever versions of whatever software you want on top of that. So this came up recently for a friend of mine who actually uses like a Ruby-based script for static website generation to publish their blog. And they were lamenting that the latest version of macOS, the Ruby, no longer worked with their script. So I said, here, this is what you need to do, and basically gave them a little recipe for setting up a Docker instance that it sounds like it's over the top and overkill, but it's a very lightweight solution for what it does. You can basically put together a Docker script that will essentially let you run like an old version of Ruby on the equivalent of an old version of Linux, and it all just works. And you can install all the dependencies, and it all lives in this little thing called a container. And then the beautiful thing about Docker is once you've come up with one of these containers, you can share the recipe with anybody else. So, like for instance, if you go to hub.docker.com, it's kind of like a GitHub, but for pre-built software solutions. And I know that's all kind of vague, but for instance, it lets me run on my Mac a perfect simulation of the Linux web server that my website runs on. And I can bring it up or shut it down. I can experiment with installing completely different, Linux software as the back end, trying new packages there, and just experiment on my Mac. But you could use it to do just about anything. Like you could use it to run a Minecraft server on your Mac in a container that didn't have any impact on the rest of your Mac. So kind of the basic idea of Docker is to be able to compartmentalize a whole software stack into a kind of a protected little environment. And then you can run them on anything, really. You can run them on a Linux server. You can run them on your Mac on Intel. You can run them on Apple Silicon. So it's been a really nice tool for me over the past few years to really not only have these really predictable environments to run specific tool chains in, but also just the fact that I can try so many different things, and you can use Docker to run, for example, a command that you would have used to have had to completely like install. Like people use Homebrew or a similar technology to install open source software, but that really kind of, I mean, not to mean it in too pejorative of a way, but it really messes up your system if you are concerned about like what's installed. And the nice thing about Docker is you don't have to install everything on your actual Mac. It just all goes into a little protected container.
In fact, as I understand it, I know several folks are using Docker specifically for Homebrew. And those
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So if you want to there's nothing preventing you from running everything that you would let affect your whole Mac, running it in a Docker container. And then, it's just a nice way for predictability, and then just to kind of feel a little protected from the various software you might not feel so confident about installing on your main Mac.
The thing you said about that makes me most interested is the word lightweight, because I feel like we're getting to this inflection point where like historical utility tools are just getting so heavy. It's like um, I took a gig last year doing some screencasting for Windows, and I was going to do it with Parallels, but it just added so much weight. It felt like to my Mac, with all of the various tools that come with it and everything. So much so that I just built into the budget. I said, "You guys buy me a Windows laptop, and I'll mail it to you when I'm done."
Yeah.
And Dropbox is another example. I feel like it's become so much. And then like everybody's talking about this new app, Maelstrom, which is kind of like a lightweight Dropbox client that takes away a bunch of features, but suddenly doesn't have, 30 different processes running on your Mac just to sync files. And I feel like Docker is like akin to that, where people are coming up with these lightweight solutions to solve narrow problems and not become a huge thing on your computer.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I use the term lightweight is not that it's completely lightweight, but that in contrast with what you used to have to do to achieve the same thing, um, like it feels like you've installed a complete installation of Linux on a custom server, but it's not really that. It's just this little clever configuration. I don't even claim to understand it completely, but at its core, the concepts behind Docker aren't like we're making a whole virtual machine. It's more we're making it's a little bit more along the lines of the crossover approach in that it's just making the environment exist that the app expects to exist.
Yeah, did you hear me try to explain what crossover does? Because I honestly don't understand it. So me explaining it earlier was pretty rough.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the fact is, as I'm talking to you here, I said earlier that I'm on my beautiful MacBook Pro. I didn't bother quitting and restarting my whole Mac. Among the many things that's running right now is Docker hosting a complete simulation of my web server. And I just loaded the web page here to make sure that it's still up, and there it is. Uh, it's so nice. I just keep Docker running, and it means that I can try anything from like the whole larger world of open source web, networking based development. I can try it relatively worry free, and in a way that I can just try it and throw it out if I don't want it and experiment. It's a really nice tool.
Any other apps or services we should check out?
Well, I'm just looking down my list here. I won't go on as long as I did about Docker, but one other third-party app that I use all the time still is a friend of mine, Gus Mueller, makes a great image editor called Acorn. That's almost always open, to be honest. There's this other app I use all the time, and I'm not a prude by any means, but I'm a little embarrassed by the name of this app. And it's for people who ever want to open a huge binary file and make hex edits. And you guys might know the name of this app already, but it's called Hex Fiend. I don't know if that's familiar to you. It's a great app that is just super reliable for anything, like editing huge binary files. And then the other thing that comes to mind is this is particularly valuable to folks who might have like an old scanner. You guys fall into this trap where you get an older scanner and then they stop supporting the driver. I'm looking here at my ScanSnap S1500M, which is at least 10 years old, but works perfectly. Sure. And the only reason it works perfectly for me is because of this app, VueScan, VueScan. And it's like a one-time $40, $50 purchase, but it basically, their expertise is like having figured out how to support old scanners that the companies don't want to support themselves anymore. And I just love that they give me the power to keep this thing out of the landfill. So that's a cool app.
Yeah, that is always an issue, right? When hardware companies decide not to continue, and I'm glad that there are third parties out there trying to pick up the slack.
Yeah, I'm looking at their webpage. It says we reverse engineered over 6,500 scanners.
Wow.
So you know what? They deserve my $40, $50, whatever.
Yeah, they do. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. And 10 years, man. We're not going to wait 10 years to have you back. I promise.
I would be happy to come back at any time. It's always really, really fun to be on this show and any of your other shows. It's a great time.
Yeah, and there's just a lot to cover with the Mac, and there's so much going on, and you are like so much at the front edge of this stuff in your role as developer, and also tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Oh yeah, so Core Intuition is my podcast. Folks want to check it out. It's at coreint.org. And it's me and my longtime friend, Manton Reese, who is also an indie developer. He makes the micro.blog service, which it's funny. He's a longtime Mac developer who has branched out into being a web service developer, but it's basically it's kind of an open, civilized alternative to Twitter. And but we do this show weekly, Core Intuition, which is basically us chatting like we are here, but all about the triumphs and the defeats of indie software development, trying to keep ourselves motivated, reacting to what Apple does, talking about our progress with our apps, talking about what Apple's doing, how the world, what the world is doing in tech and Apple in general. And it's just kind of, I sometimes call it like my weekly therapy session with Manton, because I can just go off on whatever challenges or excitements are facing us in the Mac development world.
Yeah, and if you're interested in, the perspective of developers, this is a great window because Manton and Daniel, Manton's been on the show as well, and these are very well-spoken gents who really understand the business, and I find it very insightful every time I listen.
Thank you.
And where else can people find you, Daniel?
Well, we hinted at this earlier. I am on Twitter. Daniel Punk Ass is the name. And it's funny. I think of it as so tame now. I know people find that name provocative, so maybe don't type it at work. But it is my name on Twitter. I'm also on micro.blog with the same name. And Red Sweater, this past year, I had the great joy of graduating from red-sweater.com, which I had to say for the last 20 years, to being able to just say redsweater.com, because I was finally
You killed the dash. Congratulations.
I killed the dash, and I was finally able to acquire the domain that I've been coveting forever. So it's a very, very happy upgrade. Redsweater.com, you'll find all those apps we talked about. And then between that and the Twitter, I think you'd be pretty well set to discover more about me.
How many red sweaters do you own, Daniel?
The funny thing is I don't own any red sweaters. It's somehow I got all of my...
I'm let down.
I know. But I did own a red sweater at the time I came up with the company name. It's just that it was just a ratty old red sweater with holes that didn't last much longer than the establishment of the company. So I happened to be wearing this red sweater when I had to come up with the company name. And then I came up with the company name, and I've yet to. Maybe I feel like the sweater has to be so perfect or so good to live up to the namesake now.
Yeah, the standards of the software. You just
right.
Just
I can't just pick any red sweater. You don't want to just get like a cheap red sweater that's gonna, shrink in the wash.
Like when you go into a restaurant and they've got like the first dollar bill hung on the wall.
Right.
There you go.
I have this image of Daniel with this like a moth-eaten sweater hanging behind his desk.
I wish I would have kept it in retrospect, but I didn't. I think I got rid of it before I knew quite what a legacy there would be.
All right. Well, I was giving Steven a hard time, but it's my fault we didn't get you on the show. We are not going to let that happen again. Thanks so much for coming in, Daniel. And we will see you soon. We are the Mac Power Users. You can find us at relay.fm/MPU. You can find our forums over at talk.macpowerusers.com. Thank you to our sponsors today, and that's our friends over at 1Password, Smile, Electric, and Squarespace. And we'll see you next week.